I'm super excited to be here with you today, and I want to introduce my co-presenters. I'm going to let them introduce themselves. Dr.
Hi, I'm Jera Niewoehner-Green, also at The Ohio State University, she, her, hers pronouns, and so glad that y'all are here today with us.
And hello, my name is Jaelene Loor Suche. I'm from also The Ohio State University, I'm first year of master's.
I'm Mary Rodriguez, Ohio State University, she, her, hers pronouns.
Great, thank you guys so much. So before we get started today, we really want to take a minute to ponder this first question that we have. So what are the first things you think of, or what comes to mind when you think of marginalized, minority, and underrepresented groups? So take a second to think about that, and then maybe we can have a few people share out if you're comfortable doing so. Would anyone like to share what comes to mind when you think of marginalized, minority, or underrepresented groups?
I think about the big eight identities. I don't know if y'all see an identity wheel, but the big eight identities, and typically the things that are marginalized identities that I don't have privilege in, is I think about those first. Sometimes it relates next to race or ethnicity, but other identities that again I may or may not identify with.
Absolutely. Anyone else? Yes, Dr. Edwards.
People, groups that have been historically disenfranchised, oppressed, treated badly, dominated by whatever or whomever has been the dominant culture in a given social system.
Absolutely. Anyone else?
I think about gaps that exist in these massive support, like social life, access to opportunity, gaps in building knowledge, gaps in resources.
Absolutely. And all of those definitely fall into those categories of marginalized, minority, and underrepresented groups. Today, though, we're going to talk about breaking barriers of gender and sexual orientation within agricultural and extension education. So what is the purpose of our session? So we really want to explore the challenges surrounding gender identity and sexual orientation within agricultural and extension education, and how we can prepare future education and extension professionals to have some of those tough conversations, and how to engage with stakeholders when talking about gender identity and sexual orientation. So our objectives for this session are to identify the challenges that agricultural and extension educators face regarding gender identity, sexual orientation, and heteronormativity, to learn from each other how we have had those conversations and what mechanisms we've used to overcome those conversations and work through some of those challenging conversations. And then lastly, identify some resources that we can all use going forward to help us better engage and learn more about gender identity and sexual orientation and heteronormativity to help us work through those conversations moving forward. But in order to really understand this topic, because of its complex nature, we really have to understand some of the terminology that goes along with this topic. So sex, that's a label that you get at birth, assigned by a doctor, whether that's male or female, that's given to you at the hospital. But gender is a social and legal status and a set of expectations from society, behaviors and characteristics and thoughts, usually along the lines of male versus female. Again, that's something that you're assigned at birth. However, a gender identity is something how the individual feels inside and how that person chooses to express themselves in society. Whether they choose to express themselves as their gender that they were given at birth, or if they choose to identify as the opposite gender. That's their choice. Sexual orientation, a person's sexual and emotional attachment to another person, whether that's a male with a male, male with a female with a female, or any other variation of what that looks like. Heteronormativity describes the ways in which heterosexuality is normalized through mired practices, so it becomes naturalized as the only legitimate form of sexuality. So this is a barrier that has been faced in agriculture and extension education, especially as we think about the history of agricultural and extension education and agricultural and natural resources as an industry, how we look at those gender barriers. LGBTQ+, an acronym for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer, or questioning, used to describe a person's sexual orientation. Equity, a policy of equal opportunity for all persons, no matter their background, race, religion, gender, ethnicity, or any other identifying contract. Or inclusion, it implies cultural and environmental feeling of belonging and sense of uniqueness, representing the extent to which individuals feel valued and respected among their peers and in society. So really understanding this terminology will help progress forward in helping all of us understand gender and sexual orientation within the field of agricultural and extension education. What are some of the everyday challenges that members of the LGBTQ community face? Discrimination, hate, harassment, bullying, exclusion, and the list could go on, and we could continue to build this out of what members of the LGBTQ+ community face, not only in a certain profession, but in our society as a whole. No matter where you're at, these individuals are facing barriers each and every day of their life. Going off of that, this map can show you exactly how some of these individuals are facing that discrimination, that hate, and those major challenges in their lives. You'll see the light blue and the dark blue. That's where LGBTQ+ laws are more accepting. Not that they're accepted fully and they're welcomed every day in society, but they're not going to go to prison for the rest of their lives, or they're not going to be sent to death because of being a member of the LGBTQ+ community. Where you look at the dark red, and it's pretty eye-opening for those who aren't members of the LGBTQ+ community of where in the world you can still be sent to your death for being lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans. So it's really eye-opening to look at this map and take into consideration equity is not there in the world for LGBTQ+ individuals. But how can we as a profession build equity and inclusion for LGBTQ+ community members within agricultural and extension education, therefore helping our industry of agriculture and natural resources grow in our inclusion. So here we're talking about a little bit of barriers that youth in the LGBTQ+ community face. So bullying of LGBTQ+ youth usually is rooted in hate from their peers. Whether that be someone in 4th grade or someone in high school, that's where it's usually coming from. And this bullying can usually lead to these individuals being high risk. What are they high risk of? They're high risk of being linked to substance abuse. And we see this within the LGBTQ+ community, not just of youth, but in older adults too. Of this bullying leads to them making negative decisions because of the impact that others have had on their life that has been so negative, and it makes them feel not included. And then LGBTQ+ youth are at risk of being entangled in the juvenile justice system, also resulting back from that bullying. When a child goes through bullying time after time, it makes them think that they're so unwelcome that they're going to start to retaliate. And that can lead to being involved in fights. It can lead to being involved in controversial conversations, which can lead to eventually the justice system having to get involved when it gets to that level. However, there's no policies and practices that ensure access for LGBTQ+ youth to be engaged with mentoring and community programs. That comes from Mallory et al. 2014, and they're really specifically talking about 4-H and community-based programming in this article, where there's no policy that connects 4-H and other community-based programs to LGBTQ youth to help them be engaged in their community, to help them feel included, and to create an equitable environment for these youth to be involved.
Okay, so I'm just going to share a little bit. These research here is really rooted in the United States, but I was kind of wanting to look at a little bit more historical context of why we have like such the binary that's present, as well as how these norms have been upheld in agricultural context. So I found it really interesting that this idea of kind of the family farm and this kind of social construct that we have of the family farm was intentional and by the USDA when they were really wanting to kind of push for increases in rural populations. And so when 4-H was developed, there was like very specific programming around healthy hetero partnerships. You know, how can you support, you know, the man in their farmer role, and how can you be a supportive wife? And we see that with those 4-H activities and how they were developed. So they were very gendered in terms of boys being able to engage in livestock, where girls had to do something like, you know, needlepoint or those types of activities. So it was like very structured in that way. But this has kind of continued, even though programs such as 4-H have really changed the types of activities that they're done. It takes a long time for social constructs to change. And so we still kind of see this heteronormativity that pervades U.S. agriculture in particular. And youth organizations have, in agriculture, have really kind of reflected some of this rural community prejudice against LGBTQ plus youth. And so oftentimes it's hard for them to kind of find their space within some of these programs. And some of the work being done now is looking at the university level and looking retrospectively at what some of these students' experiences were as youth, because now they're able to speak more openly in these academic settings with researchers. But there's really a lack of published research related to sexual orientation in education and youth and agriculture. And really there's been this kind of invisibility of sexual orientation, like it's just not present. So not even having really that voice there. So oftentimes if research is going to be done with youth, it might be disaggregated by gender, but not looking at other parts of those identities. Thinking more globally, again, found a big gap in the literature there. So there wasn't a lot of literature on sexual and gender minorities. I did appreciate this terminology though, in order to kind of speak about these groups in this way, because we know that the LGBTQ plus is very much a US Western kind of construct of how we call those groups. So being able to have a little bit broader term, I thought was kind of helpful. But we know, and if you know your history, you've been here in Greece and started to look at ancient history. I mean, gender itself has always been fluid. I mean, there's documentation of transgender priests in Mesopotamia, and oftentimes we've found that in a lot of spiritual practices across the globe, where we have a lot of fluidity there in terms of gender identity, and as well as sexual orientation. When we look at ancient Greece, there were often times when men and women were split into their other camps, and there were relationships that were established there, and that was completely accepted. So having that fluidity is nothing that's new, but most often around the world, that is still going to be the minority. And so that's where we kind of want to start to get more language around that and kind of push the conversation forward. This article in particular was really talking about, like, you know, how this gender and sexual diversity really exists globally, but that agricultural research is really not including that, as well as the policy work around it. So I gave some examples here of just some third gender and transgender identities around the globe. I'm not going to try to do these pronunciations because I did not take the time to make sure that I would do them correctly. But those are just a few examples. Now, some of these groups, some of these terms can still be a little bit derisive, and there's definitely some discrimination that is happening in these groups around the world. But one thing that I also thought was interesting is that kind of critics of these sexual and gender minority narratives in agriculture kind of argue that they are not localized or indigenous, that they really are this Eurocentric kind of Western concept. So that's this way, again, of like keeping the invisible, right? And so, because actually a lot of this understanding is indigenous and localized, but it hasn't taken the time as researchers to necessarily uplift those voices in agricultural research. So.
So now that we've really given you a background of LGBTQ plus individuals and the LGBTQ plus community within agriculture and extension education and around the world, we're going to do a group activity. So we're going to break out into groups. So I feel like we're already broken out into groups. So by tables and rows, that would be the perfect size. But we're going to really, I want us all to think about a time when you've observed or experienced challenges based on gender, sexual orientation, or heteronormativity within your careers, within your experiences and organizations, within your communities. Think about your personal experiences that you've either gone through yourself or that you've seen other individuals go through. And how did you feel navigating that experience? So whether it was a personal experience or whether it was an experience with a colleague or a student or a camper maybe at like a 4-H camp or FFA camp, how did that experience make you feel? And think about what were some of the barriers that prevented an open and inclusive environment and experience for that conversation or for those individuals in whatever setting that might look like. So let's take about 10 to 15 minutes in our groups and chat about a time that we've observed this or experienced this and how that made us feel, and then what were some of those barriers that really stood in the way.
Really the same role you have so one of the exercises that we do in the class, farmers value like inspiration in agriculture is about a lot of in the agricultural with the farmers, taking a video like things like that. So one of the strategies that they all go like one of our messages is like, hey, when they have it, they start adding that, like even at their own values, because it's really sad when they didn't value women, you know, as being women as part of the cycle, or do they attach the money, we the part of all the money, and then we start recognizing the women are like, just management. So I see what you're saying about that. Safety is better. How sad.
Because as a woman, steps that was trained anyway, so there has to have like very emotional, you know, ties to like thinking about that safety as well.
I mean, I deal with 4-H camps all the time in my syndrome, right? So I think it's really all the sense of creating a safe space. Like, I guess in a professional setting, like, you know, like when I teach that to other 4-H extension agents, it's like, you know, I mean, I was raised in Mexico in a really like Catholic conservative home, right? And there's like this particular things about like male and female. But like when I'm in my 4-H job, my job is to make every youth included, whatever it's coming from our lifetime program, right? So it's not about like me losing my personal beliefs, but it's about like negotiating with the youth and the families, how we can create a safe environment for them as we can, right? And that often plays like having thank you for saying
All right. So as we come back together, and don't worry, we'll have an opportunity to talk a little bit more. I want to take a minute to share out about some of our conversations that we just had in the last 15 minutes. So what are some of the lessons learned from your experiences to help prepare future professionals? And then what does this mean for us as agricultural and extension professionals working in a domestic and international setting? How can we use these conversations to help us moving forward? So I would love for each group to at least share one example for each question, and any volunteers to start off for us. Yes?
So we had a really great conversation that sort of spanned the globe and talked about what's going on in Florida. One thing I brought up is I have a colleague at University of Maryland who has done quite a bit of scholarship and leadership in identifying queer communities in 4-H. So Jeff Howard is somebody that our team would be interested in connecting to. And him and I have both created or pushed for study abroad programs and partners in Africa and some of those countries where queer identity is criminalized or people are subject to violence. And a big question we have is what do we do with students who are queer? Right? So speaking personally, like I'm somebody who identifies queer and I work in those contexts, I just kind of zip it up and try to go along to get along because I'm in a professional setting. If I'm working with a student, at what point would I ask them to keep an invisible identity, if it is invisible, kind of personal, for the sake of their own safety, right? My priority with the student is always going to be their safety. But then how does that affect their ability to be identified freely? And so we have both contacted our study abroad, try to get resources, and there's not really a lot of literature to kind of put it out here. What is the guidance on that? So that's just something that we want.
Absolutely.
Kameron, I just want to say that I appreciate that because I had a non-binary student, a trans student in the past going to study abroad, and I had to navigate some of that. And it is a challenge. It's a challenge for them. These were freshmen. These were first year, just feeling like they were just maybe being themselves and introducing themselves to a new world in college. And that was a really cool thing. Thanks for sharing. I just wanted to say that I resonated with that.
It's really complicated.
Yeah, and I think that a lot of us are unprepared for that, and then those resources aren't there. So, as we continue to develop as professionals, how can we start to pull together some lessons learned so that we are prepared to have some of those conversations, because they're going to be challenging, and there's not necessarily going to be a right answer. But at the end of the day, it's about keeping our students safe.
Absolutely. What other lessons did we learn through our conversations? I can speak behalf of our group a little bit, and maybe you guys can chime in a little bit, but we talked about your experiences in Guatemala with farmers and some of the barriers that female farmers face. And some of those major barriers that was discussed in our conversation was that male farmers respect financial status over gender or anything else. So then we got into a conversation about how financial status in a lot of developing countries can really play a part in how you are respected from your community and how you are respected from some of the male leaders in the community. And then we also talked about how agricultural education has changed over the years from Dr. Edwards' perspective, and how even today there still might be some barriers, but being an LGBTQ plus ag teacher and being out wasn't heard of in the 70s and the 80s, but now today it might be more accepted in some regions. Anyone else would like to add to anything?
I just want to reflect on kind of how as you were commenting, there is maybe not always a lot of literature training, but this kind of self-reflecting, just sharing our stories matters, right? I mean, I just came back to school to say how can we replicate that, because we keep having content-based training when I look at the work that we're happening, because we have these conversations when we navigate with real life situations, when as much as we want to have research informed practices, sometimes you just have time to practice, right? I need to reach out to a colleague and say this is happening right now. How can we support each other as we do this transition? Thinking of your second question, and for professionals, I think the ideology around this is new, it always comes up, we didn't do this thing in the past, that's so not true. I know you mentioned a group of folks from around the world that have identified as third gender, but also in the U.S., Indigenous Americans have two-spirit. It's been around longer than country was a country, right? And so this ideology that this is all very new and no one's ever done it, I think you can challenge that a bit by saying, well, here's who's been living in these ways longer than this country's been a lot. Are we looking to them to be experts in those fields? Or are we just looking to ourselves as the only or sole Western ideology relating our voice in that space?
There's an interesting, I listen to a YouTube channel by Lindsay Holloway, and she looks at, she has like short biographies, but she has a section on LGBTQ plus European royals and such, and then also she just recently published a transgender one. And I think it would be a really good way to show like these other identities, they're not just limited to, you know, non-European countries. Like it's very much in Europe as well, and these are historical examples. So that might be a good way to start that conversation, is like just highlighting these individuals when the videos are only about 20 minutes long. But I can take out the day.
What was your name again?
Katrina.
Katrina, thank you for leading us right into our next question, which is how do we as professionals begin to have this conversation? And I think that we've really pivoted our conversation to how do we start to have those conversations and breaking some of those ideologies that maybe we first think of or the profession first thinks of that this is new. It's definitely not new. But how do we continue to adapt and continue to advance these efforts into the future to build an inclusive and an equitable environment for LGBTQ plus members in agricultural and natural resources, even more specifically in agriculture and extension education. Any other ideas? I know we're running a little short on time, but any other ideas on how we can begin to have these conversations with people of our own or different cultures?
So Cameron, in our group, and Cameron, I was going to kind of share a little bit, but we were talking about how in the culture of agricultural spaces, that sometimes there isn't that space to be able to have these conversations and to learn from each other, just like you said, Portia, of like the importance of being able to really communicate, these almost faux pas that we've stumbled through ourselves, the challenges that we've had through ourselves and through our own journey. But on the same note, the people that are in these spaces are here because we want to be here, because we have the passion and the love for this work. And I think that that's also the difficult piece, is that the folks that aren't in the room when we do create these spaces are also the ones that need to be there, need to be pushed. And so I think it's creating a space, but it's also encouraging and pushing those boundaries a little bit more in our professional conversation, in our professional work, because we can't just sit in our own comfort or allow others to sit in their own comfort when it's harmful to the communities that we work with.
Absolutely.
I just wanted to say, like, I've been working in gender for almost this decade, and I've attended a lot of different events, and it's very, very rare that this comes up. And so I just wanted to say thank you to you organizers for putting this presentation together, because and again, creating a space for this. And I agree with Dr. Rodriguez that who comes to these events matters a lot, but starting to normalize this conversation and pushing it out of these Western frameworks of understanding queer theory, I think is so important. So thank you.
I mean, I'm new to this, but so I taught middle school agriculture, and I was telling my group that I had 2 students transition. And what I found is treating it like it was just normal and just normalizing it. My students they just accepted it because they saw that I didn't want to talk to it, they saw that I fully accepted it. So I wonder if maybe finding those highly respected community members that maybe they're not even pro, but at least neutral about it, and having them encourage that might be an avenue. It's, at least starting with the neutrality aspect. And just, I don't know, that's the thing.
Absolutely. As we begin to wrap up here, we do have some helpful resources. Jaelene, would you like to share about our resources?
Yes, since we don't have enough time now, you can scan this code at the end of the presentation, and you can find different resources that you can use to know a little bit more about what we were talking about in this presentation. And also sometimes when we are not like part of the community, we assume that we cannot do anything for them. So the last resource is pretty interesting. It's about how to become an ally of this community even when you're not necessarily part of it. And also because you will always have a friend or someone who is inside the community, and even they don't say it just because of this fear of being judged by others. So you can check that at the end.
And then just final thoughts here, that as professionals in agriculture and extension education, we really just have to continually increase our competence in sensitive topics such as gender, heteronormativity, and sexual orientation. Continuing to engage with youth professionals and stakeholders across gender identities and sexual orientations will continue to broaden our own knowledge and experiences with this sometimes sensitive topic, creating safe spaces within the agricultural field. Just as the space that this is a great conversation that we created this safe space today, and the people who really care and are passionate about this topic are here, but the people who are sometimes creating barriers aren't here. So how do we really start to engage them and have them create safe spaces? And then we must continue to increase, I said that already. And then agricultural and education policy, research, and resources should continue to be visible. And we should really continue to advance and broaden and narrow the gap in literature regarding sexual orientation, gender identity, and heteronormativity within agricultural and extension education. So thank you. Those are references. So thank you guys so much for coming today. If you guys have any questions, Dr. Ng and Dr. Rodriguez and Jaelene and I would be happy to help answer those. Stick around, and if you didn't get the resources, I'd be happy to pull that slide back up and make sure that you have those. It's attached to a handout. So thank you all so much, and I hope you guys have a great evening. We'll see some of you at our